إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهده الله فلا مضل له ومن يضلل فلا هادي له وأشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له وأشهد أن محمدًا عبده ورسوله يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله وقولوا قولا سديدا يصلح لكم أعمالكم ويغفر لكم ذنوبكم ومن يطع الله ورسوله فقد فاز فوزا عظيما أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وأحسن الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. Inshallah ta'ala, we would like to continue reminding ourselves about some of the principles of this deen and some of the guidance of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam as it concerns and pertains to what is happening around us. And many of us, we feel hopeless in what is happening and towards our brothers and sisters, especially in Palestine. We feel hopeless and helpless towards them. Even though we may be able to do a few things, on the most, we feel that we cannot do the best that we should have done, or we cannot give them real aid and aid in their victory over their enemies. So I would like to remind myself, firstly, and those of you listening, to the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, so it give us a form of stabilization and tranquility and ease that our brothers and sisters, they will be aided by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But before we continue, we must note that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He mentioned that our starness and greatest enemy, as He says in Surah Al-Ma'idah, لَتَجِدَنَّ أَشَدَّ النَّاسِ عَدَاوَةً لِلَّذِينَ آمَنُوا الْيَهُودَ وَالَّذِينَ أَشْرَكُوا. You will find those who are most severe in enmity against the believers are the Yahud, the Jews, and those who associate or those who worship idols. The idol worshippers. And الَّذِينَ أَشْرَكُوا specifically means the idol worshippers in this verse. And also we must note that when we say the Jews and we say the idol worshippers, it does not mean that every Jewish person or every idol worshipper is going to be an open enemy to the Muslims. And this is something that is known in the Arabic language, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He may mention a group of people generally, but a specific group is what is intended. And this is common in every language. For if we were to say, the Americans, they kill over 100,000 people, or 100,000 innocent civilians by dropping 2 atomic bombs upon them, it is known that we do not mean every single American, or that every single American, they agree to what was done. And similarly, throughout the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He speak about the disbelievers, and speak about the idol worshippers, and speak about the Jews. But a group may be intended, and sometimes the entire group is intended. And that is important because today anything you say about the terrorists among these individuals, meaning the terrorists among the Jews and the idol worshippers, they call out upon the Muslim as being anti-Semitic, but they do not see themselves as being anti-Islam and anti-Muslim when they speak about Al-Qaeda and they speak about ISIS, and they condemn these organizations that they see as terrorist organizations. So when we condemn the terrorists among these individuals, it does not mean that we are anti-Semitic or anything like that. Rather, we are anti-terrorism. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, هو الذي أخرج الذين كفروا من أهل الكتاب من ديارهم لأول الحشر ما ظننتم أن يخرجوا وظنوا أنهم مانعتهم حصونهم من الله فأتاهم الله من حيث لم يحتسبوا وقذف في قلوبهم الرعب يخربون بيوتهم بأيديهم وأيدي المؤمنين فاعتبروا يا أولي الأبصار. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, He is the one who expelled the disbelievers from the people of the book. And this is referring to the Jews who had broken their covenant with the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam in Medina. And they waged war against the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. And they secure themselves in their fortress, that the believers, they think that they will not be able to expel them. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, He is the one who expelled them from their homes. لِأَوَّلِ الْحَشَرِ مَا ظَنَنْتُمْ أَن يَخْرُجُوا. You didn't think that they will leave. وَظَنُّوا أَنَّهُمْ مَانِعَتُهُمْ حُصُونُهُمْ مِنَ اللَّهِ. And these Jews, they think that their fortresses will prevent them from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took them from an angle that they didn't expect, and He threw in their hearts fear. يُخْرِبُونَ بُيُوتَهُمْ بِأَيْدِيهِمْ وَأَيْدِي الْمُؤْمِنِينَ. They destroy their own homes with their own hands and the hands of the believers. فَاعْتَبِرُوا يَا أُولِي الْأَبْصَارِ. So, O people of insight, O people of intelligence, O people of reflection, take this as a lesson. Take it as an example. For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has power over all things. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says about these same individual, كُلَّمَا أَوْقَدُوا نَارًا لِلْحَرْبِ أَطْفَأَهَا اللَّهُ وَيَسْعَوْنَ فِي الْأَرْضِ فَسَادًا وَاللَّهُ لَا يُحِبُّ الْمُفْسِدِينَ. Every time they kindled the fire of war, every time they start a war, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will extinguish that fire. This is a promise from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Every time they kindled a fire of war, and this is what they have been doing from the time of the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam and before his time, regarding all of the messengers who came after Ibrahim, after Musa alayhi salam. That is what they have been doing, kindling fire of war. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He promised to extinguish it. And He has extinguished so many before. So do not lose hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says about the same group of people, وَإِذْ تَأَذَّنَ رَبُّكَ لَيَبْعَثَنَّ عَلَيْهِمْ إِلَى يَوْمِ الْقِيَامَةِ مَنْ يَسُومُهُمْ سُوءَ الْعَذَابِ إِنَّ رَبَّكَ لَسَرِيعُ الْعِقَابِ وَإِنَّهُ لَغَفُورٌ رَحِيمٌ. And remember when your Lord proclaimed and He declared that He will certainly send against them, meaning against these group of Jews, those who will afflict them with humiliation until the day of judgment. Verily your Lord is quick in retribution, and verily He is the oft-forgiving, most merciful. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He promised that He is always going to send against them those who will humiliate them, not because He is oppressing them, rather because they deserve that and because of the corruption that they are spreading in the land. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will punish them by sending against them and always sending against them until the day of judgment those who will humiliate them. And look into the history and you will find that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continued to do this against them, and He will continue until the day of judgment as He promised. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised us victory against our enemies. So do not lose hope, as Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala He promised. And note, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He described the believers, or He promised before that He promised, and He decreed that these individuals, they are going to enter into the Quds again, and they're going to take over the Masjid al-Aqsa, and they are going to establish, they are going to be the authority in that land, and they're going to cause corruption in that land. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He made this decree, and He informed us of this before it even happened. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He promised that He is going to expel them. And we need to remind ourselves of a verse of the Quran where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He described the state of the believers when they see the promise of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala coming true. Again, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He has informed us in the Quran that these individuals, they're going to take over Jerusalem, and they're going to take over the Masjid al-Aqsa, and they're going to cause a lot of corruption in it, as Allah mentioned in Surah Al-Isra. And they're going to have the most might and the most power, and they're going to have the most manpower, and they're going to be able to call out to most of the people to aid them and help them. All of this Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He informed us of in Surah Al-Isra. And this is similar to the promise that was given to the companions when they were told that the disbelievers, they will gather against them, as they gather against them in the battle of Al-Ahzab. The disbelievers, 10,000 strong, gather against the few companions, only 3,000 in Medina. And when the companions, they saw the unity of the disbelievers against them, all of the disbelievers surrounding Medina, 10,000 strong against only 3,000 of the companions of the Muslims. What did they do? Did they feel weak? Did they feel hopeless? Did they lose their trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? Listen to how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala described them. وَلَمَّا رَأَى الْمُؤْمِنُونَ الْأَحْزَابَ قَالُوا هَذَا مَا وَعَدَنَا اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ وَصَدَقَ اللَّهُ وَرَسُولُهُ وَمَا زَادَهُمْ إِلَّا إِيمَانًا وَتَسْلِيمًا. And when the believers, they saw the disbelievers, all of the groups of the disbelievers gathered against them, they said, this is what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His messenger has promised us. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and His messenger have indeed spoken the truth, and they did not increase in anything but in iman and submissiveness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. When they saw the enemies united against them, they did not panic. They did not lose their iman and their faith and their hope in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Rather, they said, this is the truth that Allah and His messenger has promised us. And they only increase in iman and they increase in submissiveness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So when we see that this is happening today, and the enemies, they have gathered in the Masjid al-Aqsa and around it, and they are being aided by their allies more than the believers, and they have more allies and equipment and strength and might than the believers. When we see this, we do not lose hope in help from Allah, and we do not lose hope in the victory of Allah. Rather, we should increase in iman and increase in submissiveness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and say, this is what Allah and His messenger has promised us, And indeed, Allah and His Messenger has spoken the truth. And indeed, we know that the victory of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is coming, and the victory of Allah is near. And as we see the promise of Allah and His Messenger coming true, it should increase us in Iman and cause us to worship Allah more and have more certainty that we're going to meet Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the same way His promise has came true. And we should strive in worshiping Him and being obedient to Him, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as He mentioned, that the victory of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is more guaranteed with our obedience to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. As we mentioned previously, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has decreed and promised us that what had happened and what is happening is something decreed in His book, and it's going to come to pass. So when we see this being played out in front of our eyes, we should increase in Iman and submissiveness to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we should know that victory is only with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. As Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He says, وَمَا النَّصْرُ إِلَّا مِنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ الْعَزِيزِ الْحَكِيمِ. That victory is not with anyone, but with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the mighty, the most wise. Know that nothing is decreed upon us except by the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And know that we have some blame to take for what has been decreed against us. And at the same time, we do not lose hope in Allah. And we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He punishes the believers in this world, so that when they meet Him and they are free of any sins. And they meet Him, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will not punish them twice. But as for the disbelievers, their Jannah is this dunya. They have nothing with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala when they meet Him. As the Prophet sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, he mentioned that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will continue to test those believers that are sick, those believers that are mukhlasin, that are chosen by Him. He will continue to test them until they are walking on this earth and they have on their shoulders no sins. Our worry should be with our own self more, because we do not know if we are living a life of disobedience and we are living a life of negligence. Our salah and our zakah and our hajj and all of our ibadat, they are not intact, or they are not properly done to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and everything in our life is going good, we should be worried that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, He is keeping our punishment for the hereafter instead of this dunya. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to aid us in obeying Him and being dutiful to Him. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to aid the believing Muslims around the world, the men and the women and the children around the world, and especially in Palestine, to aid them against their enemies, and to grant them victory as He promised against their enemies, and to return Al-Masjid Al-Aqsa to the hands of the believers so that they can worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala alone in it with peace and security and tranquility. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His mercy and His guidance, for the good of this world and the good of the hereafter, and to protect us from the fire of hell. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to keep our feet firm upon His iman, and to grant us patience and to aid us against our enemies. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. ربنا أفرغ علينا صبرا وثبت أقدامنا وانصرنا على القوم الكافرين. Inshallah ta'ala, after the khutbah, we will be having a fundraising event for our brothers and sisters in Palestine. We ask the brothers and the sisters to remain, inshallah ta'ala, and contribute to the best of your ability, inshallah ta'ala, so that aid and help and food and drink and so on can reach them in Palestine, as we know that their enemies and the terrorists amongst them, they are depriving them of their basic human rights. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for His aid and His help. Wa sallallahu ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa sallam wa aqimus salah.